Hello everyone, welcome to our video. First of all, I would like to say thank you for our lecturer that already gave us the opportunity to explain about the Wagner Matinee short story by William Catcher. Well, before we start our explanation, let us to introduce ourselves. Well, I am Desisa Nabila as the first speaker.
I am Nika Denoprianti as the second speaker.
I'm Ikoman Widyade as the third speaker.
I'm Nilori Similiani as the last speaker.
Hope our presentation about the short story. The first, we would like to tell you about the plot, and the second, setting, and the third, characters, and for the last, characterization. Well, let's move for the first part. There is plot. The plot of a Wagner Matinee short story by William Catcher is flashback. Why? We can see from the definition of flashback itself. Flashback is a device that moves an audience from the present moment in a chronological narrative to a scene in the past. Well, we already know if in the Wagner Matinee short story, there are several flashback scenes. So, that's why we could if the plot of a Wagner Matinee short story is a flashback. So let's see the scene of flashback in this story. For the first, when Mr. Clark brought her aunt, Mr. Georgiana, to his boarding house, he realized how he respects his auntie. He remembered if his auntie had been a music teacher in the later 60s. In this part, the first flashback was occurred. Mr. Clark remembered how his auntie can live in the Nebraska. He thought Mrs. Georgiana and her husband, Mr. Howard, was eloping to avoid her family or insulting people that knew her. They began their life from a beginning because they don't have anything. And for the next scene of this short story is when Mr. Clark felt indebted to his aunt for the great kindness he received as a child, and his auntie has a very high affection for him. He thought how his auntie has taught him many things and accompanied him when he was reading a book. But he remembered if his auntie rarely talked to him about music, and he knew the reason why his auntie kept silent in that time. When Mr. Clark persistently beat some easy bits of the old Ariante score, he has found music books. His aunt saw up and said, "Don't like it too much, or it will be taken away from you." Her aunt told him to play whatever Mr. Clark saw crave. That's not it. It's mean the music. And the next the next scene is when Mr. Clark had a planning to repay her own kindness. He wanted to give his auntie a little pleasure, and it made him remember when they used to meet together in a closet. And for the next scene, there is when Mr. Clark and her auntie, Mrs. Georgiana, were watching orchestra, and Mrs. Georgiana immersed in playing music. Mr. Clark realized about the old memory in the Nebraska. It was a very different from the place he currently lives in, a very unseen environment, he thought. And the next scene is when Mr. Clark's the memory of Mr. Clark kept popping and made him remember his auntie Prose in the musical instrument first. He was a great teacher at the time. He remembered how much often he listened his auntie sang a song. His memory broke him when his auntie accompanied him to sit beside his bed when he was getting sick. And for the last scene of this plot, the flashback plot in this short story, is When Mrs. Georgiana thought if she listened the song was not a new thing, because she had listened when a young German once moved to a farm in the Red Willow country. The auntie tried to persuade him to join the village church, but a few days later he went to the city and came home drunk, losing with his money. Mrs. Georgiana told Mr. Clark sadly. Well, everyone, that's all the scene of this story, which has a flashback plot. So for the next material, we'll explain by my partner. Thank you.
The next slide is about the setting of a Wagner Matinee story by Willas Carter. In this story, it takes two places such as Nebraska and Boston around 19th century. First is in Nebraska. Here is where the auntie and uncle of Clark live. In this place also Clark spent his youth with his auntie and uncle. Howard Carpenter and Georgiana Carpenter love and going to Nebraska frontier to elude the reproaches of her family and the criticism of her friend. The second place is Boston, where Clark's live. Clark's live in a boarding house on Newbury Street in Boston. This rooming house is owned by Mrs. Spring. His auntie, Georgiana Carpenter, also went to this place to attend the settling to the estate. Georgiana has been a music teacher at the Boston Conservatory in the past. Thank you. The next part will be continued by Komang Widyade. Komang Widyade, the time is yours.
Well, thank you for the chance. I'm Widyade as the third speaker. We'll continue the presentation by talking about the characters of this short story. In this short story, there are 4 characters, namely Clark, Georgiana Carpenter, Howard Carpenter, and Mrs. Springer. Now, let's take a look to the first character, is Clark. Clark here is become the main character of the story, and you know this story is impressive because the main character, Clark, directly become the narrator of the story. And you know, Clark lives in a boarding house on Newbury Street in Boston. Next, there is Georgiana Carpenter, who take a role as Clark's aunt. And you know, Georgiana Carpenter is described as a middle-aged woman who had been a music teacher at Boston Conservatory. Then, the third character is Howard Carpenter. Howard Carpenter is Georgiana's husband. So it means that Howard Carpenter becomes the Clark's uncle. And you know, Howard Carpenter doesn't appear directly in the story. And the last character is Mrs. Springer, who becomes the owner of Clark's rooming house in Boston. Well, that's all from me. For more explanation about the characterization, we'll present by my partner, Niluh Desi Meliani. Niluh Desi Meliani, the time is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the chance. I'm Nilo Desimiliani, and in this video, I will explain about the characterization in a WEGNER Matinee short story by Willa Carter. The first character in this story is Clark. As Widyade said before, Clark is the narrator in the story. Clark is described as a good-hearted young man who lived in a boarding house on Newberry Street in Boston. Although he was born in Fairmont, Clark spent his youth at Nebraska, where his aunt and uncle lived. From this piece in the story, and had a revengeful affection for her. Clark is described as a young man who is deeply cares to his aunt Georgiana. He was very sensitive and emotional if when it came to his aunt Georgiana. The second character in this short story is Georgiana Carpenter. Georgiana is Clark's aunt and Howard's wife. She is described as a middle-aged woman who regrets the decision she has ever made. She chose to elope with Howard Carpenter, 10 years younger than her, and took up homesteading at Red Pillows Country, Nebraska, rather than developing her career as music teacher in Boston Conservatory. And from these pieces in the story, I owed to this woman most of the good that ever came my way in my boyhood, and gently shaking me when my drowsy head sank down over the page of irregular verbs. It can be seen that Georgiana Carpenter is a kind-hearted and gently woman. She also described as a religious woman from this piece. She was a pious woman. And besides her duty to manage the homestead and taking care of her 6 children, she still takes time to teach music to her nephew Clark. Discuss the bond between Clark and Georgiana is getting stronger. The third character in this story is Howard Carpenter. Howard is Georgiana's husband. He is a character that does not appear directly in the story. His characteristics only described through Clark and Georgiana's description. And from these pieces in the story, the most idle and shiftless of all the village lads and Carpenter, who of course had no money. It can be known that Howard Carpenter is a lazy and poor man. He is also a husband that does not prioritize his wife, Georgiana. And the last character in this story is Mrs. Springer. Mrs. Springer is the owner of Clark's rooming house in Boston. And from this line in the story, but Mrs. Springer knew nothing of all this and must have been considerably shocked at what was left by my kind woman. It can be seen that Mrs. Springer is a good woman and understands people's privacy. She must be shocked why Georgiana came with her shabby appearance, but she still welcomes her and asks nothing why Georgiana looked like that. So it can be concluded that Mrs. Springer is a good woman. Well, I think enough of my presentation and the characterization in WEGNER Matinee short story by Willa Keter. And we do apologize if we did a mistake during our presentation. And last, thank you for watching and have a nice day everyone.